What about, one assumes actually, looking at the series and reading your book as well, that one of the most horrific moments for you personally must have been going back to Auschwitz. Did you have to steel yourself before you did that?
Well, I wasn't very keen to go. I wasn't very keen to go because many of my relatives from Poland had died in Auschwitz. However, the point of the series was it wasn't an entertainment, it was about life the way it is, the way it has been. And we just made up our minds to make it as true as we try to do everything in the series. That is, I said I'll go for one day, and during the morning we'll walk around, and in the afternoon we'll do the one piece by the pond that we know we want to do. I had never seen Auschwitz. You know, I had practically seen none of those places in the programs for reasons that I'll be happy to tell you about afterwards. But Auschwitz, I hadn't been to at all. We arrived at this station, which had been looked over by the producer in advance, so he knew what we should see. I went through these terrible wooden and iron gates that say Arbeit macht frei at the top, work makes free, to these unhappy people who went there to their deaths. And I looked at the gas ovens. I was particularly keen to see bunker 12 and 11, where people were beaten and shot for breach of regulations, because I sort of felt that you must see it all. But it turned out that the things that were far more moving were ones that I couldn't have imagined at all. The Germans are terribly methodical, so there would be whole areas which contained nothing but old spectacles. It's all been very carefully collected. There weren't the slightest use, but the Germans weren't going to throw them away. There were areas which were entirely full of human hair. There was a terrible area which was entirely full of wooden legs and crutches and artificial limbs. And the most pathetic area of all, an area which was just full of little tin chamber pots that children who'd come to the camp had brought with them and that the Germans had collected. Well, by this time I was in a pretty low frame of mind. And the most awful thing was that there were pictures in the corridors of prisoners, which were just the ordinary picture, you know, front, face, number on the bottom. But many of them were pictures of quite young people, children. And to see these pictures of people taken as if they were criminals, with the tears streaming down their face, was just unbearable. Well, then we drove over to the pond, and we had arranged that I was just going to say a piece to close that program at the pond, which would arise out of what I'd seen in the morning. So I sort of walked up and down for 5 minutes, making up my mind what I was going to say. And then we did it. One take, and we go home. We had made up our minds that it was a piece which you couldn't possibly do twice. I mean, you just had to say what came into your mind. Yeah. And the thing that came into my mind, absolutely out of the blue, was the phrase from Oliver Cromwell that I quote: "I beseech you, in the bowels of Christ, think it possible you may be mistaken."
It's said that science will dehumanize people and turn them into numbers. That's false, tragically false. Look for yourself. This is the concentration camp and crematorium at Auschwitz. This is where people were turned into numbers. Into this pond were flushed the ashes of some 4 million people. And that was not done by gas. It was done by arrogance. It was done by dogma. It was done by ignorance. When people believe that they have absolute knowledge with no test in reality, this is how they behave. This is what men do when they aspire to the knowledge of gods. Science is a very human form of knowledge. We are always at the brink of the known. We always feel forward for what is to be hoped. Every judgment in science stands on the edge of error and is personal. Science is a tribute to what we can know, although we are fallible. In the end, the words were said by Oliver Cromwell. I beseech you, in the bowels of Christ, think it possible you may be mistaken. I owe it as a scientist to my friend Leo Szilard. I owe it as a human being to the many members of my family who died here, to stand here